Greetings, everybody. This is Christopher Messina coming at you from the Messy Time Studios on a glorious post-Hurricane Ian Space Coast, Florida day. It is the 7th of October, 2022. I'm joined in the studios and honored to have him here by Ed Martin, who's the president of the Phyllis Schlafly Eagles, who's joining us from Virginia. Ed, thanks so much for coming on.
Well, thank you for having me, and thank you for we were talking off the air for getting your voice out there and getting people to listen a little closer on a lot of these key issues. It's important to take the time and effort to do it. So thanks for having me and for doing what you do.
Thank you. We set this up as my co-founder and I called it for purely enlightenment purposes.
Right? There you go.
Yeah, the more civic engagement people have and pay attention, the better society gets. Obviously I prefer people vote one way, but I'd rather them vote intelligently than not vote at all.
There you go.
So, Ed, just jump right in. Love to hear about your role at the Eagles, how you got there, Phyllis Schlafly's legacy for those who don't know of her very well.
Yeah.
The floor is yours, and we'll dive in.
Well, you're nice to say thank you. And I grew up. We're talking off the air. I grew up in New Jersey, and but when I went out of college, I decided to go out to the Midwest, and so I was in St. Louis, which happens to be the hometown of Phyllis Schlafly. Phyllis Schlafly, who died in 2016 at the age of 92, and she had an extraordinary 70-year period where she was in public life. As she started out as a 21, 22-year-old kid, and then all the way down to the end, she was still writing and still involved in politics. So, I began to work with her. I got to know her about 25 years ago because we were in some of the same circles. But about 2013, I went to work with her. I was chairman of the Republican Party of Missouri, and I sat on the RNC because of that role. And then I went, and Phyllis has a wonderful office. We have an office in Clayton, Missouri, which is the capital city of St. Louis County. And
a gorgeous spot. I have been through there.
Yeah, it's a nice place. It's downtown St. Louis is a little bit it's not as bad as Portland, but it's a little bit ahead of Portland in terms of being fairly run down about 25 or 30 years ago. And Clayton became a better center for a lot of stuff that's going on. So Phyllis, I went to work with her and I learned from her. And as you mentioned, she was an extraordinary leader, an extraordinary person, great training for me. By then I was a lawyer. I had been a bioethicist. I had worked for Pope John Paul II. I had been the chief of staff to the governor. I'd done a lot. I ran for office, and I'd never met anybody like Phyllis Schlafly. She was one of the most intelligent and strategic thinkers in terms of what's happening in politics and what's happening in conservatism. And so it was wonderful. And the thumbnail for people is Phyllis founded the pro-family movement. She did it in the 1970s because we were opposing the Equal Rights Amendment. And so that's sort of well-defined. What's less defined is Phyllis Schlafly was one of the great experts on what was called the strategic balance, which after the World War II, the question was, do we appease the Soviets and get along, or do we stand up firm against them and recognize what Phyllis thought was that they're communists who want world domination? And so she was on the side that said be more hawkish, and she went around the country and she gave speeches as a lay woman, and she used to get people on her wall in St. Louis in Clayton was a signed note from retired Rear Admiral Chester Ward, and he referred to her. He said, "There's never been someone who's not a military man who has the expertise that you have, Phyllis." And so she wrote books on that. She wrote Strike from Space about the need for a Star Wars. She wrote that in the 1960s, early 1960s. So a couple of observations about her. She used to say she had it all, just not all at once. And meant by that was she had incredible education. Harvard as a graduate student at 21 years old. She had politics. She wrote best-selling books, TV shows, famous, but she had a husband that they were devoted to each other, and they were this sort of tag team, which I'll tell you a quick story about that later. And then she had 6 kids and 17 grandkids, and she had a great life. So what did she teach us, and what do we do? Our organization, we try to influence politics for the better of the country, and conservatism is what we think, but you have to understand politics. So I'm not interested in being sincere. I'm not interested in taking up your position if you have a lot of money. I'm interested in saying, what's the way we see the country? And she was a conservative. She believed especially in the Constitution and the Declaration, and how powerful that was, and then how do we make things move? And so, we sometimes, we work with whoever is smart and on target, and not too often anymore. It's Democrats, but back in the day, there were some Democrats that were, pro-life and pro-military and all. So that's kind of the basics. We have Phyllis over the course of her life and her work. She had a couple of moments or a couple of times in her organizing that are historically noteworthy. One was in the 1960s. She organized women to elect her as the president of the National Federation of Republican Women. And so she was an organizer. In 1967, August, she was to ascend to that position. She'd been first vice president, and she was beaten by cheaters. They cheated by busing in voters from Pennsylvania to the Federated Women, and the establishment rolled her. It was one of the first lessons. And the reason why is because in 1964, she backed Goldwater, and she wrote a famous book, A Choice, Not an Echo, that named names on what she called the kingmakers. The kingmakers were the party chiefs that controlled things. They overlap with a set of people that Phyllis talked about for decades and decades, which is the globalists. They tended to be the same people, not always, but for example, Kissinger was in the establishment and a globalist, right? I mean, I think he's a communist myself, but I mean, it's so we can
turn my head far enough left to see him, but I get you.
Yeah, exactly. So she was so that was one. She organized women, and she was going to be the leading American woman, I would say, conservative, and she got beat. And that was a big deal. In the 70s, she organized Catholics, Jews, Protestants, Mormons. At that point, whenever you got a coalition together, they fought about who was going to heaven. And she said, ERA hurts all of us. And she knitted arms, and they held together. And everybody from Pat Robertson to Jerry Falwell to Ronald Reagan, 6-7 years later, were riding on her coattails. And this is kind of written about specifically. One other thing she did.
Let's dive in on that. I think that'd be very interesting because for those of my listeners who, well, they all tune in to find out something they don't know a huge amount about, right? But they've heard about it. So, when you say that she really sort of formulated the vision and strategy for what would be kind of the pro-family position, and for many who will have never heard of the fact that there was this once idea of this Equal Rights Amendment, right?
Yeah.
What were the core principles that she saw as being constituting pro-family? And what were the specific harms she thought would come out of an ERA?
Well, man, we could talk for hours. I enjoy this, but first, let me set up for you. She was an expert speaker on the Soviets, and she was all over the country, and she's talking about how the Republican Party needs to be truly conservative, not soft. This is the late 1960s into the 70s. She gets a letter from one of her supporters who says, Phyllis, you got to look at this ERA thing. It just passed the Senate. So it's an equal rights amendment to the Constitution. It passed the U.S. Senate, has to pass the U.S. House. When it does, then it goes back to the states for ratification. Phyllis said, I don't have time for that. I'm beating the Soviets here. And her supporter says, from Connecticut, says, I need you to come and talk. I want you to study this. Sends her a package. And over a weekend, she reads it and she says, holy cow, the ERA, an amendment to the Constitution. There's no pronouns in the Constitution. There's no he or she, citizen, non-citizen, right? And so what the ERA would have done was basically take feminism, but much more than feminism, and put it into the Constitution. So meaning you would have had a right to abortion because that's a woman's healthcare procedure, a right to an abortion in the Constitution. By the way, they admit that. The ERA proponents admit that. They say that's right. You would have had mandatory, this sounds foreign to us now because our culture's gone so far, mandatory drafting of women for the war. Well, in 1971 and 2, you would have thought, since we just were losing a war in Vietnam, that people would be aware. And by the way, that was very unpopular. When Phyllis highlighted that, again, they admitted it. You would mandatory transgender, mandatory gay marriage in the Constitution. Cut off all the debate forever and ever, right? And now I used to joke with Phyllis, 50 years later, the left took every one of those priorities and they couldn't get them in the Constitution, and they got them mostly through judicial fiat, right? They got them in the court. They are persistent. But the beauty of it is they didn't get abortion in the Constitution. They got it in the courts. And when we got sane courts, judges, they said, wait a second, that precedent doesn't make sense. So that's what Phyllis was doing. Back to the pro-family movement. The two aspects of that I'd highlight. One is she discovered and honored the role of the housewife and the wife and mother. And all of her people in those early days were these women, housewives and mothers who were, and it was an army. Now, and that factor, that was a big deal. In a way, it solved the problem. I hate to say this way, but there was a period where a lot of our talent was, the women weren't going to law school or to be doctors, right? They were going to be nurses or teachers. This was a way that all these talented women became an army. And they were, by the way, they're really, really effective. As you know, if your wife shows up and tells you what's for, it's different than when your buddy says it. I mean, if you fight your buddy differently, but so that was one aspect. But the second thing about it was very distinctly pro-family. She would say, when you take neutral laws, for example, sometimes people say, well, the government shouldn't get into the question of marriage. It should be neutral. Well, the tax code for about 70 years has incentivized marriage, right? There is an incentive. And so you do make choices. And she would say, you need to make choices towards the family.
Conversely, this quote unquote social safety nets have
exactly
encouraged the poor not to form family units.
Perfect.
It's caused massive social dislocation. It's caused massive young men who have no personal control whatsoever. Yeah.
Perfect example. And so, yes, pro-life, yes, pro-family. Look, she would have said this. So we talked about it all the time. Ronald Reagan did some bad things as governor of California. He did some great things as president. One of them was he was very pro-abortion. He signed some bad pro-abortion laws when he was governor of California. But the other was California led the country. Reagan signed it for no-fault divorce. Now, it's hard to go back in time and have a conversation. People don't think it makes sense. But if you make it so you can get a divorce, like you can order a pepperoni pizza, or in a different era, you had to go and work, figure it out. And so, right. Phyllis, the pro-family movement, and here's a big one. Early on, Phyllis was saying parents in charge of education, of healthcare. I remember 10 years ago asking her about vaccines, maybe 8 years ago vaccines, because before we had the vaccine, the COVID problems, we had people that were worried about the number of vaccines it picked up and was it causing autism, real concerns, right? Real questions existed. And in our movement, we had pro-family advocates who were, all vaccines are bad. And then you had other people saying, you're going against the science. And I remember Phyllis saying, I have friends on both sides of that debate. This is years ago. But the one thing I will say is you cannot let the parents lose control of the kids. And that's what we've seen, right? Whether it's transgenderism, whether it's vaccines, whether it's privacy, we have the parents being. So the pro-family movement included this notion that, yes, if you have a family unit, then you have to have the parents in charge. Now, one more aspect, and I'll pause. The ERA also was trying to let the courts meddle in the family unit. And years later, Phyllis wrote a book called Who Killed the American Family? And one whole section, really 2 or 3 chapters, is about how these local courts and bureaucrats that are in charge of custody, that are in charge of managing kids' lives against mom and dad are destructive, and I think we're seeing more and more of that come to light in, say, the last 10 years. And, again, we're all for protection, all the caveats we have to say, but safety is important, but the bureaucracies were out of control. And so that's the core of the pro-family movement. Along the way, aspects of it would pop up. She wrote a book about Obama's radical notion of religious freedom and disrespect for it, in part because for her, the pro-family movement starts as a religious.
I always tell people that I'm too busy to listen to Barry and Soetoro because I'm too busy cleaning my guns that I'm clinging to on the way to my religious services.
That's right.
And on the way to the company I didn't build.
Yeah.
It's interesting. There's always, here's one of the things that I find compelling. You're right that you ever watch any Star Trek?
Yeah, sure.
The old the Ferengi rules of acquisition.
Right.
Number 38 is something like being right and an empty sack is worth the sack.
That's right.
And so in a lot of ways, being holding the right opinion, that's delightful. But are you actually putting it into practice? Are you actually making it work? And I am a firm proponent both of family-centric societal organization has proven to work beautifully in this culture. Right. And the destruction of that, and again, whoever's fault or not fault, the misery is it's always worse for the children. However, it turns out, right? However, it comes about that there's destruction of the family unit. The one thing that I've seen, which has made me it's a cautionary note in that ideally, like the parents that hopefully you and I are, absolutely deserve complete and utter control over their children, completely, right? So my friends on the left might think that's wrong. They
Yeah,
want
yeah,
to teach me
exactly.
more
Yeah.
marks than I'm willing to teach them. But anyway,
Right, right.
jesting aside, but I have seen, and it's terrible, both from kind of the work that I've done with the local school system and kids in need in this county, and what I've seen, and friends of mine do this sort of semi-professionally, in the cases where um, parents are biological in name only, and they are in no way the definition of a parent that you and I would describe, right? They're either
Right.
neglectful, they're abusive, they're drug addicts, whatever the reason is. Um, what I'm always most focused on is when it is rational. I always like the closest unit of
Right.
society to fix the problem, right? So
Right.
if it's a community, ideally the community will fix the problem.
Yep.
But
Yep.
sometimes it just doesn't work. And
Right.
so, and I know that people in the system wrestle hard. How do I do the best? I have no time for it, but friends of mine keep urging me to become a guardian ad litem. So basically, it's not a foster parent, but you are the legal guardian of a child in the county.
Right.
You're appointed by the court. You show up. You make the parental decisions.
Right.
And unfortunately, that is a necessity in our society. It's so fractured. There's such a mess. And well, we're all trying to aim back towards a place where, or should be aiming back towards a place where, family units are only formed when it's rational, when they're willing, all that. So, how do you guys think about that on the
Well,
ground?
I mean, yeah, a couple things. One is, I agree with you, and I think you can wish it was a world where the nuclear family was really functioning well, and all that. It's just not, right? I mean, we know 50% abortions and all that. I mean, 50%, excuse me, 50% divorces. But bad cases make worse law. I mean, the starting point is parents are in charge. What we discover in a lot of public schools, for example, is the starting point is the kids are in charge with the bureaucrats, right? Now, I'm all for. I agree with you. We have to now. And by the way, one of the things Phyllis was very critical about, but also very savvy about it. She knew that the power of this public school system. She started writing about it in the '60s. She wrote her own primer to teach her kids to read, and we sold it. We sell it all the time. It's because she said they're trying to screw our kids. She would never say that word. They're trying to mess our kids up by teaching them how to read wrong, and when they do, they have all kinds of problems. So, but the starting point is that we want parents in charge, but we have to adjust to the reality. Now, the problem I would say, and what we talk about is, what is it that's the best way to address it? You put your finger on the description. Local connection can make the difference. It used to be that was the parish or the synagogue or the church. Now it's the family court. Right. And the people working in the family court may or may not have the values that we would want to ascribe. That doesn't make them bad people.
Right.
It doesn't make
them bad.
They
also just have an insane caseload.
Yeah, right. Of course. Right.
Just another piece of paper I have to get through.
It's impossible, right? So again, if you ask me what's hopeful, the things that create again incentives for what I would call revival of community-based options. That's what I like to see. But then I will say, I'm Catholic. You look at Catholic charities; they've been a disaster. Again, because they're bureaucratic. In my opinion, they're a disaster in lots of their decisions on how they manage it, what they do. Their preferences on illegal immigration instead of what I would say is that focus on the family. But that's I think. Other places, though, that really are disturbing. There is a bias against dads in family courts. That is impossible to square with all of the Harvard research that says kids need dads. It's just stunning. So how do we address that kind of stuff? Again, is a challenge. And one of the problems in this moment, in my opinion, is we're in a moment, I think, where the culture is ready for lots of looks at different things. I call it a mass movement moment, and they're lurching around. We're not presenting a lot of solutions, I don't think, on the family front. We're talking a lot about jobs and all. And as you point out, what do you do when a kid's got 2.5 dads, or a dad and then a stepdad, and then they get divorced? This is the reality. We've got to be thinking about it. But anyway, so it's not a simple solution. I know that to be true.
No, it's tricky. And you raised something perhaps inadvertently in that comment, that the having spent, I love when I get into fights with leftists and I say something about Marxism or neo-Marxian and they say, "Oh, yeah, you just say that." So no, I studied at the University of Chicago with avowed Marxists. I read all of his work, all of it, including the Grundrisse. I read it all.
Right.
He had a couple of clever remarks, and mostly he was a failed stock market speculator. Had he won in the markets, we wouldn't have the Soviet Union. Ponder that. Had he been a better stock market speculator, he wouldn't have been angry at capitalism, spent all of his time in the British Library writing his crazed nonsense.
Right.
And the core tenet Leninism was you have to force people to divorce objective reality from the terms they use, right? And once you understand that, every single thing from the California law demanding doctors use a patient's preferred pronouns, it's madness. Absolute madness. And that is their entire goal. The fact that the Nancy Pelosi's Congress ruled that in debate on the floor of the U.S. House of Representatives, you're not allowed to use the word mother. You have to use the word birthing person. It's madness. Right. Orwell, had he submitted that as a manuscript to his editor, would have gotten red ink through it saying, "That's crazy. No one would believe that."
Yeah, that's too much. Yeah, I agree.
I think one of the things, but that old dictum in politics that if you're explaining, you're losing.
Yep.
Right? The people that have a clearer vision, a values-based vision of society, need to make a better case for why that works. Because I will commend my friends on the left who spent a lot of time studying things like linguistics and sociology and anthropology, as I did, when many people on the right were busy studying math and science. And so they're really good at words, and they're really good at capturing the impact and imagery of words, right? So they took my absolute favorite in terms of, cynically favorite, is there's nothing more awful prior to 10, 20 years ago than to call someone a Holocaust denier. That's a very specific phrase. Right. That's madness. You are disbelieving that the Nazi regime murdered 12 million people and shoved them into ovens. Denying that happened is crazy.
Right.
But you got to give it to the left, because anything that you touch they don't like, you're a climate denier.
Right.
No, I'm not denying anything about the climate. I think taxing me beyond belief because the planet might heat up by a degree in a year or 100 years is nonsense, right? But that ability, as Scott Adams said, Trump did so well, and Rules for Radicals did so well. Choose an opponent, freeze it, vilify it. That's what climate denier does.
Well, and I will say, let me say something about Phyllis Schlafly. And again, her life is worth studying. And you put your finger on it. She used to say, don't tell me your best argument. Figure out how your best argument fits where you want to argue. Right. If you, again, being sincere and not successful is a waste of time. I mean, it doesn't mean you change, doesn't mean you run away. There's times where you witness broadly to the truth. But here's a couple details on that. When Phyllis Schlafly was 14 years old in the public school, she was asked every day to write a paragraph every day for a whole year. She never stopped writing. On her deathbed, we published a book the day after she died. And on her deathbed, the weekend she died on a Monday, she was writing a last column that was published on townhall.com on the Tuesday after she died. She was a writer her whole life. And she used to say, if you write all the time, you will think clearly. And it was the power of words. Awesome. Power of words. And in her long career, her long life, you'd see these pop-ups where you'd say, she was giving speeches to the Daughters of the American Revolution on defense issues. And then in the 80s, she gives a speech on patents. And you say, what happened there? And I asked her. She said, I saw that we were losing the effort in this country to understand why we had a successful economy. It wasn't just our economy. It was that we had patents and property rights that incentivized behavior. You could have built, somebody could have done all the kinds of airplanes and telephones in other places. They didn't. They did it here. And they did it here. And they were Jewish and they were foreign. They were native born, all that stuff because of our system that incentivized behavior. So words were so important. That's why she loved the Constitution. But here's a great one. This is so important. In the 1980s, she put in the platform. At that time, she had great friends that were Democrats that were still conservative. times. Yeah, they were pro, but it shifted. She went with Reagan, and by the 80s, she made a decision. She had to go with the Republican Party because that was the more conservative party. It was sane and all. And over time, she was right. But she also did it because she went into the Republican Party. She attended every single Republican National Convention from 1952 through 2016. And at that convention, her goal was the platform: military superiority, pro-family, and here's the kicker: pro-life. Once she got the pro-life language in 84, she used to say, don't change it, don't change a comma. Because if you open it up, the language starts to shift, and they never changed it. And when she, the only time that I know I'm right, the only time she met Donald Trump was on a Friday in March in 2016. I was there in a side room off at the Peabody Opera House where she was about to endorse Trump. And in a room about the 10 by 10, they said it was the makeup room for the opera house, and it was chairs.
Awesome.
And she said to him, "I've spent my whole life making the platform conservative. Will you please back me up on this platform come Cleveland in a few months?" And he said, "I will." And she was holding her 2012 platform, and he said, "Can I have that?" And she said, yes. And she said, he called the kid in from outside. He said, "Put this on my seat on the plane home. I want to talk to the guys about this." And he did. At Cleveland, she was there again. They backed up everything. But here's the thing: the power of words. You say, well, who cares about the platform? Some of us believe that Scripture is, there's words that matter. But we all, I'm just teasing, but the world does. And what happened was, over time, you look at it and you say, for example, in Ireland, in the early part of this century, they went systematically through the many parties in Ireland, 10 parties, and they removed by a known effort. It was the leftists, and even the conservative parties. They took out the marriage plank. It was too much trouble, right? Don't be too judgmental, right? And by the time they voted in Ireland on marriage, it was like 90% voted for marriage between whoever you want, right? The point is, language matters, and it matters more than ever in a world. You watch the Marxists, you know better than I do. They try to change the meaning of words in such a way that they not only diminish the words, they confuse people about what the meaning is. And so Phyllis was very aware of that, especially to the point of claiming the ones you want. Don't argue only about them. And that's, for example, America First. She used to write for decades about the America Lasters, and she'd refer to these people that put America last. Right. That framing is different than Make America Great Again. I love MAGA, but America First. You say, what does that mean? Like, how do I put that together? And you say that's terms we can argue on. What
I find fascinating is I do a lot of work internationally.
Yeah,
but people, I was in a debate in Australia. I was making some comment. It was when Bush was president.
Right. Right.
And I was making some comment, and one of the Australians there, who was fairly bright, right?
Right.
Made something like, yes, but like he's looking after America's interests. Said, what would you call a country's leader that looked after someone else's interests first? You'd call them treasonous.
Right. Yeah, exactly. Exactly.
Whose interests are they supposed to look after?
Right.
Doesn't mean we're not also looking out for you. Doesn't mean that Pax Americana, much like Pax Britannia, let the seas open for trade and everyone benefited, but primarily we're doing it for us, right?
Right.
And words do matter. What I don't know why Star Trek occurs so much, because it was such an allegory about the Soviet Union, right? And one of the greatest things ever, and I bring this up constantly when I lecture to college students about communism and about what it means, both leftism here, cancel culture, and why it's so insidious, is that in the later versions, Captain Picard is held captive by the Kardashians, who were the Soviet Union. The Cardassians. That's really funny. The Kardashians.
I was just going to say, I missed that episode.
On her jet.
I missed that episode.
Until he has a pink champagne. No. Well, that'd be a funny episode. But in this one, he's being tortured. He's being beaten. He's held down. And he's got a shock collar around his forehead. And there are 3 lights above his tormentors, behind him at his desk. And Picard knows he can go free if he answers the question the way his tormentor wants him to answer it,
right?
Not objective reality. And so the Cardassian hits the lights, 3 go on, and he says, "How many lights are there?" And Picard says 3, and he gets shocked. Says, "Are you sure? I think there are 2." And that goes on and on and on. Wow. The point is, Picard, the bastion of free Western civilization, refuses to say 2.
Right. Now, I need to say something. You need to write down the idea of a Saturday Night Live skit with the Kardashians holding the card and send it out and send it out to your Hollywood buddies. That somebody's got to do that. That would be fantastic. But let me tell you, on this topic, I've talked a lot about this. In this way. Václav Havel, it became the Czech Republic president, wrote an essay called "The Power of the Powerless," and it's all about behind the Iron Curtain. 1979, behind the Iron Curtain. Why did the shopkeeper put up a sign that said "Workers of the World Unite"? And he says it's not because he was asked to. He didn't. There was no requirement that the powers that be said that. He did it. A double play. He did it so they would see it and they leave him alone, but also so the shoppers would feel safe to come there because they knew he was playing along. Now, my point is only that we don't have to be compelled by government to say there's two lights instead of the three we see. We can be sort of like the boiling frog. Everybody uses that, but over time, you just say, you know what? It's easier. You and I are lucky. You and I are very blessed. We have the courage and the career to say what we want. Most normal people are like, I'm just not going to bother saying much. I love my wife and my kids.
I'm going to lose my job for one video clip taken out of context.
Right.
Someone harangued me on the street for an hour, and I finally turned around and responded, and they put that on TikTok, and I get fired tomorrow.
Right. Yeah. Exactly.
Absolutely.
So that's the sort of. And America, you can say, well, we were always better than that. We've always dealt with this, right? There's always a give and take of this.
The power of the Act started this off.
Yeah, exactly.
Telling you what you're allowed to say. I have to ask you, I had this and because it was so absurd, I had this effusion of joy when Mayorkas and Biden announced the Department of Misinformation.
Yeah,
that
I know.
Lunatic woman who was going to tell me what I'm supposed to think. And the fact that they dragged that out for like weeks, they had hearings.
Well, sometimes you just say thank you because at least it makes the absurdity seem clear. Yeah, right. Totally clear. Yeah. But here's on that now, let me tell you about the reason that is different than the Sedition Act. It could have been that the government, and we know that the forces were at play. Here's what I'll try this out on you. You'll be able to both pick it apart and also understand what I'm saying. I call it the narrative machine right now. Yep. The narrative machine is made up of big government, big media, and big tech. And so you can call it the wrap-up smear, like Pelosi said. That was her way of saying it. She did that quote. But my point is that we've never had the government. We've had the government pushing messages in, and we had Cronkite or somebody, telling a stupid story that was a lie. That's all true. But at the same time, we have big tech using neuroscience to retrain our brains in real time. And so, you say to yourself, well, wait a second, this is much more significant. And you see that. A third, and it's all of our families are affected. We got a cousin that's this or a mother-in-law that's that is like, oh, you guys are fascists. You're like, well, where's the fact? Trump was more liberal on criminal justice than I would have been. He was more liberal on judges than I would have been. He was more liberal on all sorts of stuff. Homosexual overseas, he was more liberal on all the gay rights stuff.
My favorite was everyone telling me he hated Jews.
Yeah, exactly.
I love that. I was like, what on earth are you babbling about?
Yeah,
they look at me sincerely. I'm like, not that I've detected, and I got a pretty good sense for that. Just now, I'm announcing to you and my fans, I'm now officially booted off LinkedIn because on LinkedIn I came across this like virulent anti-Jewish nonsense that was straight out of the Protocols of the Elders of Zion. Crazy.
Right.
So I, in keeping with LinkedIn's trust and safety policies, I duly reported it. The Orwellian part is I got a response from them in under a minute saying, we've reviewed the material. It does not violate our guidelines. We know this is not the okay, great. Well, if they're allowed to post that, I'm going to respond.
Right.
So I respond to 3 or 4 of their insane, ridiculous posts. Like millions of American Jews are genocidal lunatics that want to kill Arabs. That's the kind of crap they're writing.
Right.
I respond pointing out the baseless absurdity of all that. Guess whose comments are kicked off LinkedIn?
Yours?
Mine. For calling them out for this insane Jew hatred. And people always look at me, don't you mean anti-Semitism? I said, no, because, there are multiple Semitic groups, and Jews are one of them, Arabs and others. So, no, I mean anti-Jewish propaganda. So I'm now off LinkedIn because I responded to someone spouting insane. I mean, I thought it was a parody. It was so ridiculous.
Yeah.
But no, that's perfectly fine. That's great by LinkedIn, owned by Microsoft. That's fabulous. But by pointing it out, nope, I have violated I'm bullying this anti-Semitic, anti-Jewish newspaper. I'm bullying them. So now I'm off LinkedIn.
This is what the language, use of language is why I'm sure you felt it too, when you saw Trump, Biden do the speech where he referred to the citizens as clear and present danger.
Oh yeah,
you have to know that's not a Tom Clancy book.
80
it's not
million Americans are more dangerous than Al Qaeda because they vote for lower taxes and lower and the XL pipeline.
Well, but even more sort of culturally, clear and present danger. You know, there's a Clancy book and there's a Harrison Ford movie, but the language comes from a U.S. Supreme Court decision that basically said when you have that characteristic, clear and present danger, we can diminish your rights.
Yeah, we can do anything.
We can take away your rights, and so right. So we're going to define that kind of thing again, as you should point out. The Sedition Act. We've always had bullies in government and otherwise, but I'm telling you, the power and again, the one thing I will say about our effort, Phyllis Schlafly is coming full circle to that. You know, how do we combat this? Right? How do you find the ways? One is you do what we're doing. You have communicating. You build your communities. You know, you sink the roots deep in the communities. Maybe it's only 10 at a time, 20 at a time, whatever it is. That's key, right? And then we know that but Phyllis always looked outward at the parties and at the structure and said, how do we change that? That I tell you, that's, you know, we're going to have my prediction. I don't know what you think is going to be a landslide in the fall. It's going to be a red wave like we haven't seen. I was on the ballot in 2010. I can feel it. I can see it. It's going to be a landslide. And when it is, the problem starts because the guys and gals that are in charge need to have a different vision than the same old, same old. If it's Paul Ryan times two, and I don't know that they understand the battle because at a certain point, if you're close enough, you get co-opted. And again,
it's a comfy life. It's
a comfy life. Yeah.
And the thing that I find so painful is that because a lot of the work I do, I deal with a lot of great folks.
Right.
In Department of Energy, Department of Commerce, Department of Defense, like there's a lot of really smart, dedicated, patriotic, hardworking people who, quite frankly, could make more money in the private sector.
Right.
Who actually devote themselves to doing really great stuff for us. Problem is, there's also a lot of dreck that does not, right? And there's a lot of duplicative effort and all that stuff. And so my point has always been it's very hard. Private industry is really good at right sizing, right? You have at-will employees. Things are going great. I anticipate more growth. I hire more people. Things are going bad. I lay people off, right? That's just how the cycle works, and it keeps the economy fairly efficient. But Milton Friedman's great line that there's nothing in this world nearly so permanent as a temporary government program is the problem we suffer from.
Yes, yes.
And so a range of things like every single agency, except maybe defense, has to be reauthorized every 2 years or whatever it is. Like there has to be some stop point so that stuff is just not on autopilot forever. Because that's how we've gotten to where we are. And the country is bankrupt. Yeah. We are bankrupt. There's no question about that. And if the rest of the world didn't keep writing checks to our credit card, we'd be the problem is to contemplate as you just described is the psychology of it, right? It's my wife's a physician, a geriatrics physician. All of her patients are 80 and older, somewhere around there. She's not even doing 60 to 70. She's older patients. But you know, the Medicare entitlement, it's like the third rail, right? We've created systems of support and none of us want to argue against it, right? You and I don't want to say, well, we shouldn't take care of old people's health care. Well, of course not. But there are better ways to do it.
Right, exactly. That's it. Right.
Examine how to do it.
Exactly. That's right. Changing the systems is what we have to do. And we don't have, again, there's a famous book. I think it's called The Walmart Effect. I never go quote it right. I got to go look, in which a couple chapters are about 1960s Democrat mayors who couldn't give pay raises because they had no money. And so they gave big increases in pensions because they knew they'd be out of office by the time it came to hit. That's what we have right now. We have people that are in office that are saying, well, I'm not going to be the one that says it's time to, redo the healthcare system and make it more market-based because that's going to lose me votes. I'll be long gone by the time. So, all of those things, it's why such a cynical thing happened after the, and Obama did it, I mean, the welfare to work really did work, right? It changed the dynamic for people, gave them meaning, thing and change the poverty trajectory. And Obama gutted it with a stroke of his pen. And so you say, how do you, and that was a big deal. Clinton didn't want to do it, except he wanted to be reelected, I guess, or he wanted to play. But that kind of shift, we've got to have some. Yeah.
Have you read this? Bad History, Worst Policy by Peter Wallison.
I have not. No. Nope. So I'll put it on my list.
The reason I have it, and because a book I'm finishing up very shortly, because having spent my career in the capital markets,
right?
When they were having the hearings that became the Dodd-Frank Act, I happened to be working in Doha at the time, so I was like 9 time zones ahead. And so after all work was done, it happened to be during Ramadan, so there's really nothing to do. And so I'm in my hotel room watching live Senate hearings, and like it or not, I'm the guy screaming at the television because, like, hearing how stupid some of our elected representatives are. My favorite moment was when some congressional clowns were grilling the CEOs of banks. Well, why don't you take, it's about market making and trading, right?
Right.
But why don't you take the fiduciary interest of your client? And they're all looking at each other like, is she for real? Like, if I looked after the fiduciary interest of my trading partner, I would literally give them everything I have for free. Because that's in their best interest.
Right.
I'm not their asset manager. I'm their trading partner. And I can see the headaches in their eyes because, like, I'm on national TV. Their whole goal is to make me look like a heartless asshole. Like,
right. Exactly.
I'm trying to explain to a dimwit that doesn't understand the difference between brokerage and asset management. How do you answer that question?
Right.
So
that's
ridiculous.
That's really funny. Yeah, it's true.
And having watched the entire slow motion collapse, I was one of the people screaming about Fannie and Freddie. There were many of us for years, right? Screaming from the Mortgage Brokers Association to Congress, like Goldman Sachs, right? Or Smith Barney, wherever. I have to get, background checked, fingerprinted. I have to pass a Series 7. I have to have a boss who's got a Series 63 to Series 24. All of our recordings are taped, like all of that for me to sell one share of IBM to you, who's got a PhD in mathematics and you're a portfolio manager, IBM pension fund, right? For me to sell you a share of stock on the New York Stock Exchange, this entire apparatus of education, regulation, technology has to happen. Any clown, including a lying felon, can set up a storefront mortgage brokerage operation in a poor neighborhood where people don't speak English and flog them, a balloon mortgage with no money down, with extra ratchet rates for principal insurance, with no regulation whatsoever. None whatsoever. Yeah. And Barney Frank loved it. I think his phrase was, let's roll the dice with that a little more. And when all this blew up in their faces, the media and politicians went into lockstep mode. And they're all handed a cue card that said, greedy bankers, greedy bankers, greedy bankers. They never said congressional malfeasance, distortion of capital markets.
Right.
And so bad history, worst policy is they managed to capture, as you say, the narrative machine, telling most Americans that Wall Street did this instead of D.C., and therefore they passed the Dodd-Frank Act, which caused more massive financial damage to this country.
Right. Well, and as you point out, that's one industry. They've done it to every industry now. They move their way through education, right? They've done it to education. They've done it to energy. Pick a topic, and then you'll see that once the government gets in it, that's the question, right? And back to our broader point, we could say, hey, let's improve welfare or handouts or whatever. How do you actually change the trend line on the size and scope of the administrative state, right? How do you actually? And that's a much tougher question, right? That's a much more, because what you end up with is the system. I was chief of staff to the governor of Missouri. I think I mentioned to you, and I tell people when I was done, I learned it's not the Democrats that were opposition at the time that are the problem. It's not the lobbyists that are the problem. It's not the the media that was the problem. The number one problem was the bureaucrats, 1 or 2 levels down, that are going to be there when you're gone, and they know this. They know the system better than you do, and eventually you sort of catch yourself and you say, "I'm accepting that premise from this bureaucrat." but I don't really know why. But it's because I want to accomplish this, right? So I'm on the right track to make something more efficient, make the thing work.
So
but I got to
nudged a little.
Yeah, and I don't even know it, right? I don't even know it. And so once you got a system like that, and in some ways Trump was good because he showed us that. He got nudged all over the place because he didn't realize. On the other hand, you step back and say, how could you it's like you need like 20 years of Trump or somebody like him to push the way.
Attention. This is part of what I've come to the conclusion that, if anything, the reason I do this show is it's entertaining for me. I love having good conversations.
Right.
But people, I never get this. We were living in Australia for a few years, like 20 years ago. And my wife and I ran into a younger American couple who were there as an expat package. Like, she worked for a big conglomerate. She was a factory manager, whatever the reason was.
Right.
Well, we went out to dinner once. They were nice. And she came from a large, Italian American family. I just remember that, in Jersey, like 120 people. But the point was whether Italian Americans are relevant. I remember that. And her husband was not, but he also came from Jersey. The point was, neither they nor anyone in their family nor anyone they knew ever bothered to vote.
Yeah.
And it's like, well, why bother? That's what they do.
Yeah.
I was like, they set your tax rate. It's not like it doesn't affect you.
Yeah.
They determine how much money they're going to take from your pocket.
Yeah.
You can't be bothered once every 2 years to go stand in line for 40 minutes.
So what do you feel? What do you feel on this sort of parents movement that's rolling school boards? Do you sense that? And here, I mean it like this. Phyllis used to say to me, like, every couple of years, and we had this in Common Core, right? The opposition to Common Core was hot. I mean, 15, every speech Trump gave, he said, I'm going to get rid of Common Core. Yep. And then after Trump gets in, you're like, Common Core didn't disappear. They changed the name, right? They changed the name. And now we got these parents, and I'm in Virginia. They helped roll out Terry McAuliffe, thank God. Yeah. And they're rolling school boards in Florida where you are. But do you think is that a real movement? Can you see the sustained energy?
I think what's interesting, the one thing that I propose constantly is that whatever laws we pass have to apply to everyone equally without exception. Meaning, when they pass these Common Core things, they pass these common testings, guess who's exempted? Private schools.
Right.
So all of the politicians' kids who are at comfy Quaker Day in Washington, D.C., they don't have to spend a day filling little bubbles in a piece of paper. You want to pass that law? Great. In fact, I wrote an essay about this, which brought some chuckles, but nothing more. Was on that day, I don't want every kid at Country Day School to have to suffer this torture, because I don't think any kid should. But I do think the children of every politician that voted for it, they have to get yanked out, and they have to do this.
I like
a special note from Dad. Hi, welcome to the test I voted for.
Right.
We've always been very active in our kids' education, right? When we were in Manhattan, and now we're in Florida. So I, sit on the school committees, and so we're generally pleased with how our county of Florida has run things. I do think a lot of and this is where I do get there's some daylight between a lot of me and my friends on the right. I do think children are a lot more. Well, first off, they shrug off what adults say anyway. Right. So to the extent that you've got like the flaky, green-haired, 5 nose ring teacher in your school telling you there are 88 genders and unicorns are real.
Right.
Whatever. I mean, you also have idiot teachers who are fascists. So it doesn't bother me that much. It really doesn't get to me. What gets to me is the insane assertion from, that evil woman, Randy Weingarten.
Right.
Spent 2 years closing schools. And has they just think we're just stupid? Like, you could maybe have gotten away with this before the internet. Like, we have you on record for 2 years screaming about the schools closed.
Right.
And luckily here in Florida, DeSantis, God bless
back. How about this? I hate to, I'm going to run out of time, but how about we ban all social media, smartphones banned for under 16?
I don't buy that. I mean, that comes down to parenting. But the threshold we set for our oldest daughter was what, 12? By the time my youngest became 9,
I know.
You're kidding me, right?
Yeah, right. That's what happens. I know. That's how we held the line on like social media until like 16 for our oldest. Now we got a 10-year-old who's like, I mean, but back to my thing. Back to my narrative machine. Yeah. It's not just the big government and big tech. I mean, big media. Yep. It's big tech changing their brains.
Yeah, but look, I mean, you go back to I go back to read, Cicero and Livy, who were bemoaning the sorrowful state of youth, who were decadent idiots who will never amount to anything.
Right.
You go back to the 50s where parents were losing their minds if Elvis would gyrate his crotch on the Ed Sullivan Show.
Right.
Whatever. Teenagers like to push the envelope. There's no funnier button to push than mom and dad.
Yeah.
As long as they're not doing heroin and smoking meth,
It's a hierarchy of problems, right? Low bar. It's good to know.
It's a tough one. But Ed, I know you got to go. And I really want to thank you for coming on. We will have a repeat. We'll have another topic.
I'd love to. Love to.
Good for you for anyone who's standing up for a set of principles and is arguing their corner. That's the only way you get someone. Calling people names and canceling them, like being thrown off LinkedIn say, is not changing my mind one bit.
Exactly.
So, anyway.
Good deal. Well, thank you. Yeah, thank you. People that are interested, phyllisschlafly.com is our website, phyllisschlafly.com. I'd love to come back again, and I appreciate, again, it's wonderful to talk more in depth. So I appreciate the time, and I'll talk to you soon.
You bet. And to my long-term listeners, just remember, turn off the mainstream media. They're lying to you, and tune into Messy Times.
Thank you.
Learn what Bitcoin is, how it works, and why it matters. Bitcoin 101, your ultimate guide to the fundamentals of blockchain.